A very good morning and welcome to the Breakfast Club on Asake Online. My name is Sizwakele Ndlovu. Today on the program, we are going to be talking about a particular ruling that I feel is of importance to the society at large. In November 2021 last year, a Harare High Court judge ruled that fathers could take birth certificates for their children in the absence of their mothers. And today on the show, I would like to have a chat about this with Thobekile Matimbe. And she is a human rights lawyer, and we're going to find out what makes this ruling so important and basically the general state of affairs in Zimbabwe regarding registration of births and deaths. So I hope you enjoy the conversation and welcome to the show, Thobekile.
Thank you so much.
And I would like to start. Please give us some details on the actual ruling, what was said and how it came about.
All right. So when we're looking at the Bernard Tashu case, basically it's a case of, a father who was, taking care of his, 11-year-old son and for years. And after, the mother had deserted and essentially, this child, up to the time the matter was taken to court, did not have a birth certificate. So the father had tried his best to try and access one until the matter had to find its way, before the High Court. And the High Court essentially ruled that, the births, and dates, or rather the Registrar General's office should actually avail the birth certificates, at least, should actually allow the fathers themselves to be able to facilitate that process for their children where, the child has been abandoned or deserted or the mother is deceased.
So was there any reason, is there a provision, what is the provision for fathers to do that? I know mothers are the ones who give birth, but is there something that states that mothers should be the ones, and why did we get to this point where we had to have fathers going all the way to court to get a basic right for their children?
So the Birth and Death Registration Act provides, in Section 12, subsection 2, A, B, and C for, the process by which children who are born out of wedlock can access birth certificates, or that birth registration process can be, facilitated. So you find that under Section 12, 2B, that's where, the provision says that where the mother, is deceased or has abandoned or deserted the child, of anyone who acknowledges themselves to be the father of the child can actually notify the office of the registrar of that birth and actually be able to access a birth certificate for their child. And when you're looking at Section 12.2a, it's the one that says that both the father and the mother should do this joint process of, getting the birth certificate for the child. But of course, like I said, 12.2b is the provision that covers for that situation where the child has actually been abandoned or deserted or the mother is deceased. So anyone, by the way, who acknowledges that they are the father can do that. So that's what the provision says in the Birth and Death Registration Act.
So from what I'm understanding, it's already provided for in
the
law.
Right.
So the registrar was acting outside of the law by not allowing fathers to take birth certificates because that's what should be done. Anyway, if a father says, like you're saying, if the father says, okay, I'm the father of this child, there shouldn't have been a reason to go all the way to High Court to fight for something that's already provided for.
Precisely. There should not be any barriers when we're talking about birth registration for children. There should not be any barriers. And more so because the provision in the Birth and Death Registration Act is clear that anyone who acknowledges themselves to be the father can actually, access a birth certificate for their child, as long as the mother is dead or has abandoned the child or has deserted the child. So effectively, there should not be a barrier, whether in practice or, in some fanciful idea that, or investigatory, idea by the office of the registrar, where, you find that the registrar will say, why are you coming here as the father? Where is the mother? But the father has told you the mother deserted the child or the child was abandoned. So the registrar's office must not employ this investigatory role that is outside the scope of the Act and outside of the scope of the Constitution of Zimbabwe. Children have a right to a prompt provision of a birth certificate. That's what Section 81 1C of the Constitution says. So effectively, that whole process where the registrar's office denies fathers of abandoned children or of deserted children that ability to register the birth of their children is actually a violation of children's rights.
So you mentioned something very interesting, this moral ground, especially in the case of single mothers who say, I am registering my child, but the father is not available or is unknown. And there's this thing of like, had a child without a father and all sorts of those dramas, whereas it's not their job to do that. They're just supposed to provide birth certificates, as you've outlined. There's no investigative issue, but more and more we find that across the country, so many people are turned away because somebody has decided this is not right instead of applying the actual law and basically, like you're saying, doing their job.
So the challenge that we find sometimes is, the attitudes that we find in the office of the Registrar General. They are not good attitudes that people experience when they visit that office, especially when they are trying to access birth certificates for their children. For instance, you cited something important, that a woman will get there and she genuinely wants to register, and she might feel that she's treated badly and possibly ridiculed because she's had the child out of wedlock and things like that. But you find that this whole concept around children born in or out of wedlock is the problem from the onset, because like I mentioned, when you look at even the phrasing or the title in the Births and Deaths Registration Act, that you have a whole section that is dedicated towards children who are born out of wedlock, that creates a problem in society. That also creates a problem within the service delivery when we're looking at accessing birth certificates, because there's now this, okay, your child, okay, fine, you had a child, you were not married. And then that child finds it hard to get a birth certificate because of this classification. So once you classify a certain group of children as children born out of wedlock, on the face of it, it's discriminatory. And you find that the South African Constitutional Court has already, made this pronouncement, I think in September 2021, that that distinction itself stigmatizes children who are born, out of wedlock, in quotes, for lack of, how to better address this. And you find that as well, because of that, even mothers themselves, they are stigmatized if they've had children born out of wedlock. Fathers, similarly. So we want that, distinction removed. That's what would ultimately give effect to children's rights. It would also cascade to how the registrar's office, deals with people. It would remove those attitudes, because once the law is clear, there's no distinction. Then the office of the registrar has to also adopt attitudes that give effect to that. Because what we have now is not a children's rights-based approach. It's something else that seeks to analyze the status of parents with regards to marriage, with regards to, whether or not, they have been given consent by the mothers. There's also a situation that you would want to envisage. What happens when a father says, for instance, the mother doesn't have a birth certificate, but I'm available. I have an ID. Can I access a birth certificate for my child? Well, in that circumstance, the child has not been abandoned. There's no desertion here. There's no one who has been deserted, but the mother is available, right? But she does not have an ID. Can that father also go ahead and do that? Even though the child is born out of wedlock, in quotes. So let's remove this distinction. This is my recommendation, that we need that removed.
Because a child is a child.
A child is a child. And when we're looking at the African Children's Charter, it talks about, the child having a right to, to immediately accessing, birth registration. So it's essential. It's universal, the right to birth registration.
You raised a very interesting point, because I was going to ask you for instances where the mother is not deserted, and you raised a good point, saying the mother does not have a birth certificate, or the mother is simply incapacitated, she could not be able to come through. Then it's the father's right to just say, we're going for this, and let's get a birth certificate. You mentioned something interesting about prompt registration, and it's within the Constitution to say children should be registered within a certain period of time. There's that right for the child to have a birth certificate. In cases where, for example, the mother has given birth and the father is maybe out of the country or not available or is just denied, you find instances that women wait or are not given the right to register their children. Maybe the father is known, but for some reason he's not available at that point in time. Can the mother then go ahead, take a birth certificate without the father, and then when the father is available, can the father then be added to the birth certificate? Because those are some of the issues as well. Say, or maybe the paternity is proved later. How do we handle the promptness and those relations? Say, okay, the child needs to be registered, but maybe the father is not available, is coming later or something. How do we manage such situations? What would you recommend?
Okay, so let me start from explaining one thing. The right that right that children have to birth registration has been articulated in a number of international treaties. It's also clarified or stated as well within our constitution. So you'd find that the African Children's Charter, like I highlighted earlier, speaks about immediate birth registration, and the Constitution talks about prompt provision of a birth certificate. Our Birth Registration Act talks about it in clear terms, 42 days. So in our Zimbabwean context, our idea of promptness is pegged at 42 days, which is 6 weeks. So mothers should take the initiative, because rights in the rights that children have to birth registration, it's not only dependent on the government to avail that right. It's also dependent on the parents. Parents have duties. They've got responsibilities. That has been articulated by the African Children's Charter, that they have a responsibility, right? So parents, mothers, you've had a child, you've got your birth certificate, you've got an ID, you've got the birth record. Proceed and access a birth certificate for your child within the timeline that has been stipulated by law. There is a reason for it. Because down the line, that father doesn't show up, and he doesn't come. The child will have been disenfranchised of a number of, social services. If there's been disenfranchised of, even, for instance, if they're 14 years old and you're still waiting for the father to show up without giving your child a birth certificate, how do they write grade 7? They can't. But as a mother, you are empowered. You can do it. Go and access a birth certificate for your child.
And in terms of the father being added, how easy is that process? Okay, on paper, I know there's the registrar issue, but on paper, how easy is the process to then say, my child has a birth certificate, had a birth certificate, I registered them on their own, and now the father is there and he's claiming the paternity. What is the stand on that? Is it that document is set in stone once it's written? What happens then? What are the provisions?
The document is not set in stone. The father comes, if he wants to, you proceed and you do it, right? You change the name. You find that it's actually even more hectic when the child turns 18 and now they want to change their name, and you're now an adult, you want to change your name to your father's name. Now you have to engage lawyers. It becomes a lot more hectic. But the process, generally, it's not a process that is set in stone that will say, okay, once the mother has done it, it cannot be reversed. The issue here that I want people to focus on is not the father, it's not the mother. The issue is the child. We want everyone to have a child's rights-based approach to how they handle the situation of birth registration. It's a dire situation for children, and children need to access their rights. So when we're talking about children's rights, we are saying, fine, we appreciate that there are all these things that are involved. If the father then comes later, even if he has to pay a certain sum of money, he can go ahead and do that. But at the pertinent time where he was supposed to avail a right to a child, he was not available. So do we hold the child's rights at bay while the father is somewhere else? We do not do that. We proceed and make sure the child has a birth certificate, which is exactly the same thing that should be employed by the Registrar General. If someone says they are the father, avail the birth certificate to the child. Right. If there is any challenge, any issue that arises later on, the issue here is the child has has attained something very important. They have their legal identity. They are acknowledged as a person within their country. They can write exams. If you come back later when the child has written their grade 7, so be it. But the child is accessed an education. And we cannot wait and suspend the rights of the child while we're debating whether the father is going to show up or not. As a mother, go ahead, proceed and do it. The father, when he comes, we can fix it. There are no cultural connotations to this. You can give your child the name that you have on your own documents. It's good because the child will access an education. They will write their O-level examination. They will get married. They will vote. That is empowering your child.
So we take it for granted. This has such far-reaching consequences. We're taken from a moral and a cultural standpoint. But you mentioned registration in school, grade 7, Form 2, O-levels, even IDs, voting, registering to vote, getting married. For instance, you mentioned a very crucial point I hadn't actually thought about earlier on. You said the mother might not have a birth certificate. Therefore, the mother cannot go in and stand and register the child. It's such far-reaching implications from that initial piece of paper. So we really have to wake up and have Registrar General do the right thing, basically, because forever the child is lost. You're not registered. You have no identity as a birth.
Yes. So it's literally a generational case when the mother doesn't have a birth certificate, doesn't have an ID. She gives birth to children who also will not get a birth certificate. And they also grow up and have children. And you can actually have a whole, family where you can literally trace that, well, this child doesn't have a birth certificate because the mother did not have one or does not have one. And because the grandmother also did not have one. So it's literally like flows down, from one generation to another. It actually has far-reaching consequences. And, trying to cure this whole thing, it becomes this huge mountain. But effectively, we need, processes even in the office of the registrar to be enabling, even for this kind of, scenario where we have a whole, family, that you can trace from one generation to other, where there's this perpetual lack of birth registration, so to speak. So you find that the government has a duty. In 2014, there is this United Nations #IBelong campaign, which, Zimbabwe, joined in. And, one of the key pledges was to ensure that they make this process of birth registration, more accessible. And I think we are still having a conversation where we still have challenges in our country. And Justice for Children Trust did research on this in 2007, which was focusing on, this aspect of birth registration, focused at the problems. And just recently, 2019, 2020, the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission did a national inquiry on, national documentation. Same findings that we found, in 2007. Same findings that there's a problem in our country. And the problem seems to be also stemming from the Office of the Registrar General. And you'd find that, I think, following through, this #IBelong campaign, again, my recommendation is to call on the government to make sure it does its best to make sure that this process of birth registration is made much more, accessible, much more easier, much more friendly, and much more child rights focused.
And that's the emphasis, basically, child rights focus. Let's leave culture aside. Let's leave everything aside. Let's focus on the child.
Yes.
Let's stop the issues of previous generations being perpetuated, going on and on. And for people who have issues with registration and some of the issues we've discussed, where would you recommend that they get assistance from? Legal action isn't affordable in most cases, and you'll probably find that people who are most disenfranchised are the people who cannot afford, who are underprivileged. So where can somebody get assistance if they have issues like this of getting birth, certificates and IDs and things like that?
Right. I think people should be able to get in touch with Justice for Children. They should be able to access Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. They can also access Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum and just raise these issues. And I think definitely there will be a way forward. I think these are, key organizations that have been pushing and driving this whole, let's respect the rights of children. Let's avail birth certificates for children. And I have no doubt that anyone who visits this organization will get the relevant assistance that they need, and who have children who are documented and not stateless in their country of birth.
So for those of us who are privileged, who have our IDs and our birth certificates in order, is there anything you recommend that we do to actually raise awareness or just help those people who are not registered and things like that? Is there anything we can do?
I think definitely we need to be able to, spread the word widely that people can actually access birth certificates, and see how best we can also, spread the news, not only about the process itself, but also spread the news in terms of where people can get help with the challenges. I'm, a number of people can, if you are, for instance, just moving around in your community, I can assure you, you ask someone on the street if they know someone who is struggling to get a birth certificate, you get to know somebody who is failing to access a birth certificate. So spread the word in your community, in your home, even the people you work with, you interact with. I remember at some point, I think there was some lady that was interacted with, in my home, and I asked her, and she was telling me something about, especially our helper, and she just mentioned something critical that, she has, her brother and the children are not documented, and I pushed hard to make sure that, she does something about that situation. And by pushing, I'm referring to, capacitating her with the relevant information, capacitating her with where she can go to get that help. It's very critical, I think, for everyone to take ownership over this, so that we do not have a nation that has, a lot of children that are not documented, as we are currently experiencing.
You're very passionate. You're very passionate. It comes
to birth registration. Yes.
How did you get to this point of fighting and specializing and focusing on this particular issue?
Right. So, of course, through, the line of work that I do, I will, of course, give credit as well to Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. At the time when I was working for that great organization, you'd find that, being in communities, I interacted with a lot of communities, in Bulawayo, Matabeleland North, Matabeleland South, and the number of cases that I came across, was shocking. To this date, I literally cannot believe that we have a nation that that runs when we have such a serious problem, where we have our children in this country undocumented. So for me, it's a very, it's a very sore area when I look at, the human rights record in this country, because I think that there's a lot that can be done by the government with regards to making sure that this process of accessing birth registration is simplified and it's made accessible for parents. So I think, I will attribute that to my work, my previous work. And I think even beyond that as well, I've continued to do a lot of research on this area, and I've done a whole dissertation on the promotion and protection of children's rights to birth registration in Zimbabwe. I've published a blog post for Southern Africa Litigation Center, and again, credits to that great organization as well, promoting fundamental rights in Southern Africa. And I think definitely it's an area that I think is in a gray area in terms of our human rights record in Zimbabwe. Yeah.
Thobekile, thank you so much for taking the time out to break down this very important critical gray area, as you mentioned, and highlighting the impacts and what we can do. And you mentioned something very interesting. All it takes is for you to ask somebody, ask your helper, ask people at church, do you have birth certificates? Do your children have birth certificates? And spreading the word, as it were. So thank you so much. And we wish you all the best in your future endeavors. And we hope to have you again on the Breakfast Club, hopefully with good news in the future. Say, look, things have happened, things have shifted. And if there's any other rulings, we'll definitely be giving you a call.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I just hope that everybody out there will look out for this issue and contribute to shaping a rights respecting Zimbabwe, at least when we're looking at children. Yeah.
I was chatting to Thobekile Matimbe, and she is a human rights lawyer. And under discussion today was the births and registration of children, children in wedlock. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, but most importantly, our takeaway is this. There are organizations that are available to help people. It might be you, it might be somebody you know. She didn't mention Justice for Children Trust, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights. And if you have any queries or any comments that you'd like to share, please share them with us, and we will do our best to direct you and give you details on the right organization to approach. My name is Sizwakele, Ndlovu, and thank you so much for watching The Breakfast Club on Asake Online. Bye for now.